We had a great question come in from a listener asking whether or not you should run ads to grow your podcast. So in this episode, we're going to be talking all about podcast ads. Which ones are best? Which ones you need to avoid at all costs? And most importantly, when is the best time to run ads depending on how long you've been podcasting? That's all coming up next, so stick around. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy.
Hi, Courtney. This is Laura Brazan with the podcast Grandparents Raising Grandchildren, Nurturing Through Adversity podcast. I've been really excited to launch my podcast and see the numbers rise and listeners coming in from all over the place. I have a question for you. Chartable has a program called Smart Promos, which is not a free feature. I believe to go up to the pro program, it's $50 a month, but it allows me to advertise on other podcasts. And I'd like to know what you think about programs like that.
Laura, this is a great question. Thank you so much for asking this. And I'm going to do my best to break this down in a way that's not too technical because podcast ads is one of those topics that can get you in the weeds really fast. And if you don't believe me, just Google Chartable Smart Promos and your eyes are going to glaze over in like T-minus 2 seconds. So let's start at the top. There are over 20 different ways that you could drive traffic to a podcast. The problem is a lot of hosts start their show and then they immediately shift into what I call growth mode. And they try to do all 20 plus of these things without A, a strategic growth plan, or B, knowing which growth strategies are going to be of most benefit to their specific podcast. Because as you've probably heard me say before, no two podcasts are created alike. And this is why when we work with clients in our advanced program, one of the first things we do is we get clear on the individual goals that that person has for their unique podcast, because this is what your growth strategy will be built around. It's going to be customized to your goals because no two sets of podcast host goals are alike. So of these 20 plus ways to drive traffic to a show, we can further break these down into two buckets. There are the organic strategies and there are the paid strategies. It's no different than social media. You share a post on Instagram and your immediate followers might see that, maybe a few others, depending on how much engagement that post gets. That's organic. You post, some people see it. Or you can pay to play. You can pay to share that post with more people on Instagram. And of these two categories, there are multiple different strategies that you could use. There are multiple organic strategies and there are multiple paid strategies. So of the paid strategies, podcast ads is just one of the paid strategies, which is just one of the two types of strategies, which is one of over 20 ways to drive traffic to a show. So drilling down into podcast ads. Now, when it comes to podcast ads, you've got to understand there are different types of ads. There's social media ads. There are search engine ads, both of which I will tell you right now, I generally don't recommend when it comes to podcast growth. There are some people out there who will say, oh yeah, you just got to target it. You just got to find the right people and you'll be able to convert social media people over to podcast listeners. The reality is, in most cases, for most podcasts, that's not the case. Sure, there might be a few exceptions to the rule out there, but most people who are on social media or who are browsing search engines are not looking for podcasts to listen to, which is why the conversion rate of these types of ads tends to be pretty low when it comes to driving traffic to a podcast. But there are other types of ads, and there are plenty of podcast-specific ads. There's website display ads. There's audio streaming ads, ones that play on the free version of Pandora or Spotify, for example. And then there's in-episode ads, and these can be played pre-roll. These can be played in the middle of an episode. They might be played toward the end of an episode. But pre-roll and mid-roll are the ones that are the most common, and host-read ads being kind of the holy grail of podcast ads. Because think about it. If you've got a host who has thousands or millions of listeners, and those listeners trust that host, and that host recommends something, they are actually saying that they recommend this or that or the other thing, those listeners are going to be more likely, A, to pay attention, and B, to click through and go check out whatever it is that that host is promoting. So the types of ads that are best for podcasts, generally, not all the time, but generally are ads inside of other episodes read by the host of that podcast. So if you're tracking with me, let's continue breaking this down because there's two ways that you can go about this. And you know me, I like to break things into whether you have ample time or whether you have ample resources in terms of budget. Do you have time? Do you have money? If you have time, the free organic route would be to collaborate with other hosts where you could say, hey, I know that your audience might benefit from learning about my podcast and vice versa. So why don't we do this? Why don't we each record an ad, a host-read ad that we could play on each other's shows? Now, the upside to this approach is it's free. The downside to this approach is that it's time consuming because you got to find the right shows. You got to make sure they've got enough audience to make this worth your while. You've got to pitch that show. And then there's the logistics of actually figuring out, okay, what should we say that would best serve your listeners, recording it, inserting that into each other's podcasts, and then having no real good way to track on the back end whether or not that's driving any traffic to your show or not. So it's kind of like a shot in the dark in some instances. So this is why on the flip side of that, you see podcast hosting platforms and other third-party platforms like Chartable offering these paid ad services. So if you have a budget, even if it's just a little bit of budget, then the other option is to go through your podcast provider to run these ads on other shows. And they assist with the matching to some degree and with the targeting to some degree. So the upside of this is that they're relatively inexpensive when it comes to paid methods. There's some targeting that you can do. It's a little bit faster of a process overall. But the downside and the problem is most of these in-episode ad campaigns that you can run on platforms like Buzzsprout, the targeting is really limited. And more importantly, you have no way of seeing which ads perform the best, which means there's no really good way to tell which ad or if an ad actually converted someone who heard that ad to a listener. So if all of this is making sense, then here's where we get into Chartable's Smart Promo feature. Because unlike most podcast player ad services, this particular feature, it's new, it's in beta, and it's a reinvention, if you will, of regular in-episode ads that offer tracking. So what Chartable's Smart Promo feature is what they're doing is they're able to help you attach a little piece of code or a pixel to your RSS feed, which helps you see which ads are actually resulting in conversions or which ads are converting best. So if you're familiar with Facebook ads, this is kind of similar to a Facebook pixel, which tracks where that traffic is coming from, if that traffic is converting, which ads are causing more traffic to convert, which ads are better performing, worse performing, and so forth, so that you can gain an understanding of which ads are most effective. So Chartable also claims to use more advanced algorithms to help you target potential listeners who are most likely to be interested in your podcast based on their previous listening habits and preferences. So this on the surface sounds kind of cool because it's like, wait a minute, if they're going to have this advanced algorithm that can help me get my ad in front of people who based on their listening habits would be most likely to be interested in my podcast, that's a good thing, right? And they're using a specific model, and this is a technical term. You might hear this thrown around as if you Google podcast ads or anything to do with podcast ads, DAI. What it means is dynamic ad insertion. So Chartable is using a dynamic ad insertion model, a DAI model, which means that they're basically inserting these ads based on the listener's habits and preferences versus a fixed ad. So an example of this would be if you were listening, let's say, to Entrepreneurs on Fire, for example, and you were listening to that and there were two listeners listening to that. Listener A with a dynamic ad insertion model might hear ad A based on their listening habits and preferences of other podcasts to go and listen to. And listener B would hear ad B based on their listening habits and preferences. So with this quote unquote better targeting, this is supposedly designed to give you better results. And I say supposedly because this sounds good on the surface. But if you have listened to this show for any length of time, then you have heard me talk before about how listeners are becoming increasingly savvy. Just like on social media, more people are tuning out and turning off invasive ads, which does two things. It makes it harder to track, and it makes your ads less effective, which makes the money you're spending less effective. And so there's a divide that is starting to happen in podcast advertising as well, where some companies believe that listening to a podcast should not trigger this privacy invasive tracking. So they're going to give you the tools you need to target your ad campaigns as effectively as possible without stepping on the rights of your listeners. Other platforms are using these advanced algorithms to target potential listeners who are most likely to be interested in your podcast based on their habits and preferences, but not taking into account the rights of your listeners or their privacy. So both types of these ads are designed to help increase your podcast visibility and attract more relevant listeners, but it's going to come down to the degree to which you value integrity. Because at the end of the day, if you are hosting a podcast and you truly are in service to your listeners and you want to attract more listeners like that and more listeners who share those same values, then we have to operate within that value system. And ads can be one of those things where it seems almost too good to be true in some sense. You put some money behind it, you throw some ads out there, and we're like, great, we're going to get some more listeners. And yes, it can drive new listeners to your show. But there's more to consider here. Another thing to consider is Chartable's smart promo feature. First of all, it's still in beta. Second of all, you have to be on a paid plan, which starts at $50 a month, at least at the time of this recording. And that only limits you to 3 smart promos per month, which also cost more money in addition to the subscription cost, right? So you're paying the subscription cost for access to this feature. And I spoke with Chartable and I confirmed this. There are additional advertising costs involved. Now, these costs can vary depending on the platforms where your ads are displayed, depending on the channels where your ads are displayed. But before anything else, you've got to have a budget in mind. And you've got to review their pricing terms carefully to understand the full scope of the costs that are associated with using this feature and with running advertising campaigns through Chartable. And as it goes with any ads, I don't care if we're talking podcast ads, business ads, Facebook ads, whatever it is, there's a common saying in this space, and that I've heard many times from my own mentors through the years, when people say, well, how much should I be spending on ads? And the answer is, how much are you willing to lose? Because the reality with ads, this is just me being totally transparent with you. There is no guarantee that ads will work. It might work. If you have extra budget that you are willing to put behind that and to be able to test this over a period of months to see what's working and how to tweak that and how to dial that in, then okay. But I'm also here to tell you that there are a lot of other things you could do to drive traffic just as well, if not better. So whether or not you should run ads on your show, and then depending on what type of ads you should run, is going to boil down to a few things. Number one, your goals for your podcast. And a close second to that is your timeline for growth. Your timeline for growing your podcast shouldn't be as soon as possible. We got to be realistic here. And again, when we work with clients on their growth strategies for their show, we're projecting this out over a period of months and years. This is not like, let me run some ads and I'll see an increase in downloads next week. This is a strategy for the long-term growth of your podcast. But here's the thing, and I know this about you listening right now. If you've got a podcast, and if you listen to this podcast, then your heart's in the right place. Your values are likely aligned with my values in that we're here to serve our listeners first. And we are here because we know that podcasting is a long game. This is not an overnight fix to grow your audience. This is not a get rich quick kind of a thing. And so our goals for our podcast need to be reflective of that we're going to be doing this for the indefinite future. So it's not about just having a growth plan that can get us to our outcomes that we want as quickly as possible, but it's about having a growth plan that can serve your podcast and your listeners and your personal goals for your show and your business well over the long term. So number one, goals. Number two, your timeline. Number three, it comes down to the overall growth strategy of your show. And whether or not ads needs to be a facet of that strategy or not. I mentioned at the start of this episode, there are so many ways that we could drive traffic to a podcast. And driving traffic to a podcast is only one side of podcast growth. The other side is converting listeners from that podcast and driving traffic to your email list, to your offers, especially if your goal is to grow your business and your audience through your podcast. So we've got to take into account the overall growth strategy of the podcast. This is important because otherwise you're just going to be trying thing after thing, tactic after tactic, and it's going to be a spaghetti approach and you're going to wind up frustrated. And then the fourth and final thing that it boils down to are the specific elements within your growth strategy. So taking into account the overall growth strategy in light of your timeline, in light of your podcast goals, and then dialing in the specific elements of the growth strategy to help you reach those goals over that timeline. If ads is one of them, then knowing which type of ads are most in integrity for you to run is going to be key. You're going to have a clear budget. And I would caution you not to set your expectations too high. But generally speaking, again, this is a generalization, but my recommendations typically for when to start considering ads as part of your growth strategy doesn't come immediately after you launch your podcast. It doesn't even come 6 months after you launch your podcast, and sometimes not even a year after you launch your podcast. If you are 0 to 6 months in your podcasting journey, your focus right now should be dialing in your systems and mastering your messaging, because you're still very much laying the foundation for your podcast. So the bare minimum, you should be releasing an episode once a week. You should be sending that to your email list. You should be sharing it on social. But that's pretty much the baseline. The problem is most people expect that to be all that they have to do, and that's not the case. This is like the bare minimum we're talking about. And then from here, we can look at, okay, now that we've got this strong foundation, we've got the systems out in, we've got the messaging, we've got the release schedule down. Now we want to build a strategic growth plan for the show. So from about the 6-month mark to the 12-month mark, give or take, your only focus should be refining those systems. It should be mastering your performance as a host. Maybe this means hiring a voice coach and doing voice work. Or maybe this means getting better at storytelling or presentation skills. And also at that point in time, this is when we begin to start identifying the first objective that we want to achieve with the podcast in terms of growth, and choosing one growth strategy to focus on. Notice I didn't say 20 growth strategies or 20 different things or 10 different things or 5 different things. One thing to focus on. Then for the next 1 to 2 years, you want to continue mastering your craft. That is always going to be a part of this equation. And begin experimenting with new content and layer in 2 to 4 more, I usually recommend, organic strategies. And if you have the budget for it, perhaps one of those strategies can be paid. So we're essentially stair-stepping the growth strategy over the long term of your podcast. This is so key. And then 2+ years in, you can layer in more strategies, and more of those can be paid again if that fits your specific growth plan. Just to give you an idea, I am 4+ years into hosting this podcast. We have only just started experimenting with paid ads for the show this year. And I can't say that we've had any stellar results, to be honest, but we're still testing. Testing is still in progress, and those tests may reveal differently in time. And as you've heard me say before, having a testing mindset, having an experimental mindset when it comes to the growth of your podcast is going to be really key. And I will link to another episode in the show notes where I talk about how to identify the objectives for your podcast and then how to develop an action-based activity plan to keep you focused on the activity that's going to bring about the outcome that you're going for. So one final thought on ads. If you are going to run them, please make sure that you go through a reputable source to do so. In many cases, going through your hosting provider will work well. Chartable might be okay. There are some other services out there that we have tested and that we would recommend. But again, keep in mind the success of any campaign depends on the accuracy of the targeting algorithms and the quality of your ad creatives. And there's no guarantee that every campaign is going to yield the desired results. And some campaigns are going to be more difficult to track listener conversions than others. And it's going to take time to optimize your performance. An ad strategy is not a silver bullet to growing a podcast. So I really appreciate this question because this is a question that many podcast hosts wonder about. Should I be running ads? And many of them have tried it and have been unsuccessful and then have gotten frustrated. But it's also because maybe they didn't have the broader scope or understanding of A, how ads work, B, which ads would be best for your specific podcast, and C, how those ads should fit into an overall growth strategy for the podcast, depending on how far along you are into your podcasting journey. So, Laura, I hope that this helps to give you a little bit of a clearer understanding of if and when to run ads for your podcast, And for you listening right now, if you've got questions about this, please head to the show notes. There's a link there where you can shoot me a text. Send me a text. I would be happy to break this down further or to go into any more detail that you're looking for in future episodes. And if you found this helpful, then I would love it if you would let me know. Scroll down and leave me a review. And then stick around because I've got something really special for you coming up in the next episode. We're going to unpack the top 5 content repurposing mistakes that podcasters make that's causing your short form podcast content to get overlooked right now. And we're going to answer the even bigger question of whether it's really possible to turn more of your social media followers into loyal podcast listeners. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.